Byron is going to, again, most of us here have come basically to help young researchers. The fundamental idea of this symposium is helping other people. So Alison took you through in terms of what are the basics of research in any level that we need to do in order to set ourselves clear so that who reads our papers or dissertations or projects will see it in a structured way. And I'm sure Byron is going to help us clarify some more other components that need to be addressed as well. So you can get all these slides from us, but what I would recommend is to think what these people are saying and creatively ask, in my research, what would fit and what doesn't fit? Or if I'm going to do such and such, what kind of questions do I require to ask? In my master's thesis or master's project, this is what I'm going to do. So what component of what they said will help me? And also, once they are gone, they're all from Australia. It'll be a long way for you to reach out for them. So you do ask them. They're here for the next 2-3 days' time. So please stop by and ask them all. Okay. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff. It's very building out here. I was actually just watching the chairs. You can really lean back and relax. I'm not sure any of my students would stay awake with their chairs like this. They'd be asleep in the first minute or two. It's so comfortable. Okay, so just by way of a background, and Jay's mentioned that we came from, a number of us come from Australia, so myself, Alison and David. Just to give you a bit of an idea, it took about 36 hours to get here. So I'm kind of a little bit jet lagged, even though I arrived on Friday. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to cope okay with the next hour and a half. But if I find myself fading, I'll let you know, and I'll expect you to ask me a question and to wake me up in some stimulating way. Who knows who this is a picture of? Do we have any sort of philosophers in the room? Who wants to have a guess? Who do they think it may be? So we've got a few philosophers. So who do you think it may be?
Socrates.
Sorry?
Socrates.
Yeah, Socrates. Okay. So does everybody know who Socrates is? So a Greek philosopher, famed for his philosophy around justice and good. Most notably, I guess there's a dialogue between him and Plato that actually formed the basis of what we know now as social contract theory. So this idea that organisations or individuals have a responsibility to do something which meets or is in line with the expectations of society. We call that, I guess, the licence to operate. Now, so Socrates is very much also famed as one of the forefathers of logic. So the idea of actually being able to develop logical arguments and actually being able to structure those arguments in a way to persuade people. And that's very much the focus of this presentation today. It's very much about sort of saying, okay then, if we're academics, the goal is not actually just to collect data, and it's not just to produce a thesis or a dissertation or some report. The goal is actually to collect research, like Alison alluded to, with the intent of resolving a problem. Now, part of the problem with resolving a problem, and part of the problem with doing research, is it requires us to synthesise a lot of information and present it in a way that's persuasive. So the goal of doing good research, I would argue, is to persuade some audience to engage with you in a debate, a conversation, a dialogue about some point or area of interest. Now, if you're a researcher and you can't actually engage in a conversation, whether it be a conversation with peers, academic peers, or researchers that are actually interested in similar areas to you, if you can't engage in a conversation with them and somehow influence them positively from the findings of your research, from the arguments that you actually make, your capacity to have an impact, so the capacity of your research to extend and to actually have an impact on those around you is going to be limited. Okay? So as an academic, one of my responsibilities is to review papers for publication in peer-reviewed journals. And one of the things I identified a few years ago was the major limitation, one of the fundamental reason why articles don't get published, or I was tempted to provide a negative or a less than optimistic or positive review, was that they didn't persuade me. They may have had great data, they may have actually executed the analysis with sophistication. They may have demonstrated that they understood literature. Doesn't necessarily mean they synthesized it well, but they read broadly around the literature. But somehow, when it all came together, it wasn't persuasive. It didn't do the job of taking me along on a journey with them, and certainly didn't persuade me to take either an opposing or a supporting view of their argument. I say opposing or supporting because sometimes a good argument is about creating tension. The goal is actually to get people to oppose your point of view initially, so that then when you start presenting your evidence, you can diffuse that argument, you can actually respond to that opposition. Now, just before I get into the meat of the presentation today, and it's pretty, it's quite dense at times, and I'll probably cut across some of the content a little bit quickly, but I'll do that intentionally because the slides are there for you to reference or refer back to later, okay? So even if I don't cover it in enough detail today, you have an opportunity to raise a hand and ask a question. I'm happy to go back and clarify. Or alternatively, you can refer back to the slides later and also the reference material that I'll refer to. And hopefully that will still be the basis for you to actually to engage that material more meaningfully after the presentation today. But just before I do that, let me just get an indication of what background you have. So who's doing a master's degree at the moment? Just a show of hands, please. A bit higher, give you a bit of an indication. Okay. Of those, so keep your hands up. Of those, how many of you have actually finished their defence? So you've done your proposal, your confirmation seminar. Okay. So the vast majority of your early stage sort of master's students. That's okay. So about 50%. Who is doing a PhD at the moment? Maybe a show of hands. Okay. So for those of you that are doing a PhD, how many of you have actually defended your topic here? Just keep your hands up. Okay. So it gives you a bit of an idea of where you are in the research, journey. And how many of you are actually early career researchers? So you're actually in a faculty position somewhere, you've completed your PhD, and you're kind of looking for tips on how you might actually be able to exploit your research findings for publication. Okay. So it's actually a pretty nice sort of breakup. We've got about 50% that are master's students, another 25% although that are PhD students at various stages on the journey, another 25% or so that are early career researchers or faculty members that are probably just looking for a few tips on how might I actually be able to publish more effectively for my research. That helps me to actually understand. Now, in this presentation, so I'm actually representing today I'm coming from the University of Canberra. Who knows where Canberra is? Anybody who's heard of Canberra? Oh, thank you. You know, in Australia, sometimes I put that question to my students and the hands don't go up. I have to say, it's a bit embarrassing. So Canberra is actually the national capital of Australia. It's where our political parties come together to make laws and generally to argue with one another. And the Service Innovation Lab is a consulting company, a spin-off company that I actually have that I use for doing consulting-based research in Canberra, mostly in the public sector. So that's by way of an introduction. Hopefully the presentation goes a bit quicker. Who's heard of PhD comics? Yeah? Okay, one. Goodness, God, you need an education. So PhD comics was a great source of wisdom, of humour for me when I was doing my doctoral studies. This particular comic talks about how, I guess, the evolution of the academic. So when you start off, you're a doctoral student, you're a grad student, master's student. You're doing research because you want to do something that you're interested in a topic or an area and you kind of want to research it, okay? Then you become a grad student, and then all of a sudden you find that most of your time is dedicated in responding to questions of your supervisor or advisors, and maybe you might feel that initial passion that you had, the question you wanted to ask is maybe not there anymore. You feel sort of a little bit swamped by the process itself. You may get through that okay, and then become an early career researcher. And all of a sudden you've got a whole other set of pressures you've got to contend with. So you've got to teach, you've got to administrate, you've got to publish, you've got to do so in a way that enables you to develop a portfolio that enables you to get through tenure. So to get a job, a permanent job in an academic institution. And then, okay, you get through that process, you get tenure. So in the Australian system, we don't actually have tenure. We have a system whereby you've got to annually go and demonstrate that you're progressing in a positive way. And if you can do that, well, you keep your job. You don't, you've got to make an argument for why you might actually sort of be fired. But in your tenure professor, maybe the pressures are a bit different. Maybe it's not so much about doing what you need to do to build that portfolio, but now it's maybe about sort of bringing money in to show the university that you've got capacity to be a leader. And then maybe you're down here, and all of a sudden you're an emeritus professor, you've got a bit of freedom, you actually start to focus on those questions once again. And I don't know where I am. I think sometimes I'm kind of, somewhere in here somewhere, okay? Now, what are all these groups have in common? Who wants to hazard a guess? Come on, guys, go out on the limb. You can only be wrong.
They're doing research.
They're all doing research, okay? They've got that in common. They've got a desire to do research.
They all have motivation.
They all have motivation to, I would say, and this is actually pretty close to the answer I'm looking for here. They all have motivation. They've got motivation to what? To get through, to survive. Is that their motivation? Is that through the process they end up here sometime? I don't know. I reckon the thing that holds them in common, the thing they have in common is that the missing link is the audience. Okay, so all of these people are actually doing something. They're motivated to produce some output, some research, which meets the need of some audience. And I guess that's pretty true of the research process. Now, when we're doctoral students or master's students, it's all about the process, isn't it? And I guess what we heard today was really quite helpful because Alison explicated in quite a bit of detail what that process looks like. But when we're learning to do research, it's very much about one thing after another. So you learn how to sort of frame your question, you learn how to identify appropriate method, you learn how to collect data, you learn how to analyse it, and then right down into this process, some point down here, you may then sort of contend with how do you actually publish that research. Not the thesis, but how do you actually take it to a peer-reviewed outlet, and how do you actually put your research up to be, I guess, reviewed by your peers, by your colleagues. How do you survive that process? So, quite often, it's really when a student or an early career researcher gets to this point, that they realise that it's a whole other skill set. It's a whole other skill set. Maybe the process of learning to do research is not quite the same as the process of how to publish your research in reputable journals. So today, one of the things I want to talk to you about is I want to talk to you about that process of how you get your research published. And I would argue that the major issue in getting your research published in a good journal, like I said before when I talked about my peer review experience, or my reviewer experience in peer-reviewed journals, quite often it has to do with how persuasive that argument is. Now, Alison, I thought did a great job talking about how you frame your introduction, whether it be to a proposal, whether it be to your thesis, or importantly, whether it be to the front end of a paper. So many of the elements that Alison talked about, what I'll be talking about is the tools to enable you to frame those pieces of information, that content in that introductory section, to enable it to stand a better chance of success. Now, where Alison provided some very useful templates, what I'm going to be providing is the logic of the arguments that stand behind that template. Okay? Now, like I said, some of this stuff is not easy, okay? Seasoned academics and researchers that have been at this stage for quite some time still struggle with some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. So if you don't get it straight away, the terminology isn't easy to grasp it, you're not dumb, okay? You're not silly. It's hard stuff, okay? But if you crack this nut, if you do this well, you'll have a very, very successful career in academia. It's my promise to you. You feel like voting for me? I feel like a politician, you know? Now, I would actually argue that research is actually not about the production process. It's actually more like orchestrating conducting an orchestra. So it's not about doing your little bits in sequence to arrive at the end goal, which is a paper. It's actually about bringing those things together in such a way that masterfully creates some synergistic outcome, okay? Where the result is greater than some of the parts. And that's the ideal research model. I mean, I don't think all research necessarily has to subscribe to this process, but nevertheless. Okay, so what am I going to be covering today? I'll talk about why arguments. I'll give some context for this notion of an argument and what it actually means. I'll talk about the parts of an argument. I'll look at using those parts. And that last point about assessing and revising your argument, I actually won't cover, but I've included the slides. Okay? So that part's actually there. Just really just frame some questions that you may want to ask yourself once you've completed it. So you've built your argument, you've written your paper, and then maybe you want to go back and assess it and see whether or not it's had the effect that you're after. So I've got some questions you may want to ask yourself to help you to refine and build that, and to qualify whether or not you've actually achieved the objective of a good academic argument. You'll see here I also have a little progress bar, 9%. You're feeling daunted at this stage? It's been talking for how long? We're at 9%. Don't worry, I'll move through quite quickly. I also apologise. I know we've got a camera there, and I'm not playing to the camera, I've got to say, but I'm Australian, and by Australian or international standards, Australians are regarded as being fast speakers. Okay. Now, by Australian standards, I'm regarded as being a fast speaker. So you combine those two things, and usually what that means is it's like sitting in an audience, and I've got a machine gun, and I'm spraying words at you. Okay. So that's what you're feeling. Rest assured that by the end of this day, you'll have some references you can look back upon. And if you want to ask me some questions, I'll have some contact details at the back end of the presentation. And you can actually, you're more than welcome to contact me and ask me any questions.
Shouldn't it be 10% by now? Is it still 9%?
Everyone can ask questions except for David. So, why do you write an argument? Now, some disciplinary backgrounds learn the art of arguing very early. So if you're a lawyer, for example, everything you do is about framing an argument and supporting that argument with evidence. Now, in the social sciences, like I said, I don't think this is a skill we necessarily pick up via osmosis. Some people are naturally gifted in argument development. Some people, we know the people, don't we? The ones at school that are always in the debate team. And some people love arguing. They're very good at arguing. When we get into the nitty and gritty of doing research, often we get so focused on the data and so focused on analysis and interpretation that we forget. At the end of the day, we're doing that for a reason, and it's all about providing evidence for the argument. So anyway, so why are you writing this argument? Because we make arguments every day. Arguments help us to reason well. They help us to understand, what evidence or what information we need to gather. And in particular, help us to make judgments. So they provide some scope or boundary for our understanding about something. Okay? So they provide some boundary for our understanding about something. Good arguments provide the capacity to tell people not just what we want to say, but also, importantly, what we don't want to say. So Alison talked about that in the context of definitions. It's very true in the sense of arguments as well. So to make a good argument, we need to employ information, logic, and persuasion to arrive at some sound conclusion, and hopefully, if you do this well, mutual agreement. Mutual agreement with who? Our audience. So all arguments have to have some perspective, some focus. And that focus is very much about communication, engagement, and a conversation with an audience. So one of the things I actually, before I go on to the next slide, one of the things I really try to do with my doctoral students when they're struggling with these concepts, is I try to get them to think about a group of people, a community, an audience that they want to communicate with. I try to get them to think about, well, what are the conversations that are occurring in that community already, and how might they engage in that conversation in a meaningful way? But the final stage is how do they then persuade that community, that audience, to come along with them on a journey. Okay, so argument's appropriate. Now, we're taught when we grow up not to argue. We're taught it's a negative consequence of poor social behaviour. But argument is natural. It's around us. It's everywhere. Politicians make a living out of arguing. In Australia, we've got to say, not terribly effectively. They're often arguing amongst themselves at the detriment to the decision-making process itself. But, and I can say that because I come from Canberra, but in the context of research, argument is appropriate. Argument is the building block for you actually communicating with an audience about the things that you think are important. So it helps to know how to act or think about ways you feel beneficial, sort of suitable and necessary. So down the bottom here, we make this point that when circumstances require trust, respect, belief in our evidence or agreement, or with our reasoning, we need an effective argument to provide that foundation for those things to occur. Arguments everywhere, it's pervasive. Like I said, it's not just in politics, it's not just in academic journal articles or publications, but argument is everywhere. Everybody employs in some degree of argument. One of the, I guess I would argue, is one of the shortcomings of the novice arguer. I'm not even sure that's a word, arguer. Okay. One of the shortcomings of the novice in terms of argumentation is they fail to represent all of the views that exist. So they put forward their view, they support their view, but they ignore the counter views, they ignore the alternatives to their viewpoint. We'll talk about that later in terms of one of the parts of a good argument, but it's important to sort of think at this stage that there's more to just you putting your point of view forward to be an effective at creating an argument. You also need to be able to consider and also respond to alternative views. Now, if you do this well, argument can be productive, it can be collaborative. It requires a negotiation with your audience, and hopefully you get their permission. So if you do it well, they give you their permission to for you to take them on a journey, whereby you can explore some of your ideas and get their sort of response to those ideas. That's usually what we want to do with a journal article. Because if we don't do this well, so the introduction is not framed well, the argument's not set up well, you generally get rejected at the desk. So you send a paper to Jay, he reads it and sort of, I don't really think this is for me. And he sends you back a nice letter that sort of says, oh, why don't you have a consideration of this journal or that journal? Now, that's not what you want. So the first test, or litmus test of a good argument is whether or not it gets through the desk. Argument is conversation. I've already covered this point. So it's about obtaining permission and expressing information. So, and I guess in the context of the research process, Alison covered this. It starts with a problem. Makes us realise that we have an interest in seeing that. It's really about setting up the problem that Alison talked about in terms of the introductory statements and the purpose statements, about engaging, setting a context, getting permission to go forward. You claim a solution, so you make a claim, and then you support that claim with evidence and reasons. And that's the process of a good argument. So a lot of the thinking that's embedded within my presentation today comes from this book. Okay, so The Craft of Research. Now, it may or may not be part of your required readings if you're doing masters for a master's program or a PhD for a PhD program. I actually, I quite often give this as a textbook when I meet early career researchers, just to kind of give them a bit of a leg up in terms of the process of moving from being a student to being an academic. I do have an electronic version of this, which is available for reference purposes only. So if you'd like to get a copy of this book afterwards, just have to copy an email, and I'll be happy to share that with you. But it's not for redistribution, because that would be inappropriate in terms of the copyright. So if it's for reference purposes only, you can request a copy of that of me. Now, one of the good things about argument is I think we've all had experience with developing essays. We say what we're going to say, we tell them, and we tell them what we told them. That's not argumentation. Although a good essay has arguments embedded within it, argumentation is broader, particularly in the academic sense. So it also avoids things like a default structure or chronological order. So when Alison talked about literature reviews, I mean, it's really quite common with early career researchers and doctoral and master's students to actually just see a sequencing of ideas without synthesis. Argumentation is the process of synthesizing. And really addresses this question of so what? Because there's nothing worse than actually spending a lot of time collecting data, analysing that data, reporting and presenting that data, and then someone sort of says, well, so what? I don't really think what you've done is actually important. If you're an academic, you're a research student, the last thing you want is when you submit your thesis for examination or defence, that the panel or the examiners, as the case is in Australia and the UK, come back and sort of say, well, where's the contribution? So what? You've done the research well, but the contribution seems to be redundant or seems to be sort of insignificant. So good argumentation helps to avoid that because it places your research in that conversation, as I said previously. Now, 24% is okay, David, or I?
Much better.
Oh, thanks, mate. So 5 parts of an argument. So the craft of research, which actually comes out of the University of Chicago. It's the backbone to their Little Red Writing book, Little Red House. I don't know, I can't actually remember what they have a writers program which was actually developed in recognition that academics were very good at doing research, or students were quite competent at doing research, but they lacked some of the skills in terms of presenting that research. So it's actually an international program which is taught out of some of the best business schools in the world. Now, and also other non-business disciplines as well, like engineering and medicine and all that. So preparing for your argument. So we heard this morning about a problem statement. I don't going to spend a lot of time revisiting that. That's really about understanding and about framing your problem in a way that enables you to then set it up for evidence and support. This idea of framing a situation is debatable or contestable. An argument helps to resolve that process. It provides a way of actually moving forward, particularly when, for example, there's no logical gap. There's a lot of conflicting evidence. And we see that sometimes, don't we? It's almost as an empirical question that lies at the heart of something, but the literature doesn't provide any real guidance on which way it should be. So argumentation helps us to actually frame a course of action. The results, it may be you need to collect more data, or you may need to frame your position or your problem statement in a different way to enable you to make a contribution. But nevertheless, it provides a way forward when things seem to be at a loggerhead or at a point of no progress. Yeah.
Would you mind giving them an idea of a statement as opposed to an argument?
Okay. Well, I think we did a problem statement. I thought that Alison covered that in a fair bit of detail. But I guess in the context of this, you have a problem statement. Now, a problem could be a management problem, which you then translate into a research problem. You provide some context. So when I talk to my students, I talk to them about ring fencing, about putting a ring fence around the problem area, and then about specifying that in a way that enables you to position your problem within some broader context of theory or literature. And I guess an argument is different to that, in that once you've actually framed that problem, once you've actually set that problem up, you then need to go away and actually collect the evidence. Now, part of the framing is argumentation. Part of the decision-making around what evidence to collect and represent and present in support of your argument is argumentation. Part of the interpretation of the results, once the research has been completed, is argumentation. So argumentation doesn't have a role to play at one point in that journey. It's present in all stages. So from my point of view, I would see argument as being it's the orchestration. You're the conductor. You're pulling it all together in a way which is meaningful. Does that help at all? Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I remember from last year that you gave a beautiful example of an argument.
Okay. For those that weren't there last year, I'm sorry you're going to miss out this year. I don't have a beautiful example to provide on this occasion. But I guess from my perspective, I see argument as being the glue that holds all the pieces of research together. Okay. So to sketch your approach.
If I could.
Yeah. Do you remember the example?
Yeah, it said something like a boy going to his mother saying.
Oh, that comes up.
Ah, okay.
Yes. So I wasn't as forgetful as I thought. But, when I move progress in this presentation a little bit further, I'll provide some examples of how to actually do this. And I think that's really important as well because, this is very much an applied science. Okay, hearing about it is not quite the same as doing it. So you'll hear a lot of good ideas about how you might frame an argument from this presentation today, I hope. But then you'll have to go away and actually apply those. And actually, it's the application of that knowledge which is actually really quite challenging. But if it was easy, when everybody would have a PhD, really an academic. It's not intended to be easy, I said that previously. So, sketch your approach. What do you want to show? Why should your readers agree? Based on what evidence? And what are some of the possible alternatives and objectives? So these are kind of the questions you kind of want to be framing at the early part of your argument development. So phrased formally, this activity leads to the parts of an argument. So it leads to your claims, leads to your reasons, leads to your evidence, leads to your warrants, and it leads to acknowledgements and response. They're the 5 parts of an academic argument, and we'll talk about each of these in turn. So these 5 parts correspond to what the craft of research refers to the questions, or the 5 questions of an argument. What are you claiming? What are the reasons you have for believing the claim? What are the evidence you base those reasons upon or on? What principle connects or makes the reasons relevant to your claims? So what warrants? And warrants is actually probably the toughest element in this whole argument development process. So that's the bit where I provide that example. And what potential disagreements or difficulties your audience might have with your claim. Now, interestingly, when you actually start to engage with literature, the first point is to start to make claims. So you'll read something, and you'll come down on the side of some position. Okay, you'll think, okay, from what I've read, so from the literature I've synthesised, from the previous research which has been conducted, this seems to be the case. Now, those claims can be framed in a range of different ways. But you need to actually specify your claims. And that's not dissimilar from that process you go from positioning your research to coming to a problem statement. But specifically, each of the elements of that introduction, those was it 4 elements of the introduction or 5? Yeah, 4 elements of the introduction that Alison talked. Each one of those is a mini argument. Each one of those points requires you to make a claim about some position and then provide the reasons and support for that claim. So we can either have a reason and therefore make a claim, or we can claim because of a reason. So, and I'll provide an example in a moment, but the goal is that we've got to come down on the side of something. Okay, once you've done all the reading, once you've done all the synthesis, you actually need to make a decision. You need to claim something, and then you need to defend that claim. So a claim is the main point. The so what. Okay? So claims should be either clearly conceptual, so seeking to change the way we think about something. So often, Alison talked about inductive and deductive. The one that sort of lies in between that is abductive. We're actually seeking to make conceptual claims about some set of reality, some aspect of reality. And you're trying to propose or hypothesize or take people, you're trying to get permission for them to come with you in terms of testing some of those propositions about that conceptual area that you're examining. Or pragmatic, okay, you're seeking to change how you act. And I guess that's true of most research we're doing in social sciences and in business in particular. Is ultimately we have both a conceptual area or contribution we want to make. We want to add something to knowledge, make some contribution to the way the world sees this particular problem space. And we also want to make some practical difference. So that contribution of knowledge we also would like to think, at some level, is relevant beyond the walls of academia. So claims should, by definition, require good reasons. Audiences should be able to disagree with your claim and, by extension, be convinced or converted with your evidence. Like I said, sometimes the point of a claim is really to set up a position of opposition, to create tension. And then, as a consequence of the way you progress that point forward, seek to resolve that tension with evidence, with logic, with information. So, reasons and evidence, most familiar aspects of written and oral argument. So, our data is evidence. But we don't start with the data, do we? Is that true? Who agrees with that? Who says we don't start with the data? You guys are smarter than I thought. I'm joking, of course. So evidence, data, I mean, different types of research, different approaches to research could be, you could start with data. It could be an inductive piece of research with a goal, which is to come to some conclusions. So in that sense, your reasons precede your claim. Or alternatively, you can actually start with your claim and then you're seeking sort of research or evidence to support that claim. So in the context of building arguments, most people have some understanding of the type of evidence or reasons they're looking for. So even if you haven't actually set out to resolve a particular claim, you have some sense of what you want to do and what you don't want to do. Okay, so most powerfully, evidence and reasons are effective in the structure of an argument when they're utilised to support some position. So you're collecting that evidence. So it's an inductive piece of research. You're collecting that evidence or those reasons, with a view to somehow formulating an argument. Okay, so you know at the end of this process, the goal of which is to persuade somebody to take some conceptual view or to take some action. Now, what that sort of says to me is that evidence or data, as I like to think of it, doesn't sit alone, okay? It doesn't sit in isolation to the problem you're trying to resolve, or it doesn't sit in isolation from the argument you're trying to develop. Now, it's a fairly subtle thing, and this is why warrants are important. Because sometimes you may feel you understand the logic of why you're trying to collect the evidence you're collecting, or you may understand the way that evidence relates to some claim that you're trying to make. But your reader, the person you're trying to persuade, may not actually be persuaded. They may not be in agreement with you. So sometimes you need to actually go back and actually have to challenge the logic that sits behind that relationship between the claim and the evidence, or the claim and the reason. And that's, the only way you can do this is to actually investigate and unpack every one of those relationships between the claim and the reason and the evidence. And you need to actually think about whether or not, so what's the logic that hides behind that relationship. Now, the word we use to describe that is warrants. Okay. So warrants express a general belief or principle that influences or explains our judgments in specific cases. So it talks about that relationship and it provides a way of understanding that relationship. So an example of a warrant may be, measure twice, cut once. So the logic that sits behind that is when you take the time to do a thing properly, you don't make mistakes. Another example, and it provides the warrant, for example, in this context, that it is never a good idea to hurry a task that you claim. Careless mistakes take longer to fix and would to do things right the first time than it would be to do things right the first time. So the goal here is to actually understand that you've made a claim. You've made a claim about the importance of actually, well, in this case, not hurrying a task. And you provide some logic that actually links the reason for not hurrying a task, which is to avoid actually doing things over again. And you're providing that logic in a way that actually, or that warrant, in a way that links the reason to the claim. Does that make sense? Yeah? Do I have nodding of heads or have a shaking of heads? Okay. So in academic writing, quite often what happens is people will present reasons for a claim that they think makes sense, but the logic that sits behind that is not so obvious to the reader. Okay? And that's the challenge of doing good persuasive writing, is you've got to kind of think, well, what could be the arguments for or against this logic? Are people going to accept that logic without question? Sometimes that is the case. So I'm doing a piece of research at the moment, for example, looking at, actually, what am I doing at the moment? So I'm writing an article looking at dispersal in regions of Australia. So we have tourists that come to a capital city, and do they disperse beyond that capital city into the region? So that's a research topic I'm looking at the moment with some colleagues. Now, one of the warrants that underlies the research that we're actually doing is that it's good to distribute wealth equitably. Okay? So how might that warrant relate to the research? Well, the claim we're actually making is that regional dispersal is important. The reasons we're providing for that claim are that when you actually disperse tourists into the regions, you provide a number of benefits. So you create employment opportunities for people who work and live in those regions. You provide internationalisation for that region because they get to learn and understand about new cultures. You provide infrastructural investment in those regions because you've got to actually build infrastructure to accommodate those visitors. Now the logic, the warrant that lies behind the relationship between the benefits of dispersal and the claim that dispersal is good is this idea that distribution of wealth is a valuable, beneficial thing. Does that make sense? So in the context of warrants, we didn't have to actually defend that claim because it was understood that is a good thing. Whereas, for example, if your claim is something like, and actually I've got an example, I'll show you. Okay. Okay. I'll show you later. I thought it was a bit earlier. But sometimes people's logic is wrong. The thing that they believe in, so you might actually have a very powerful belief in the importance of something, but that belief may not be shared by your audience. Okay, so for example, there are in the corporate social responsibility space, there's an argument about a contemporary versus a classic view of corporate social responsibility. So a contemporary view is that organisations have a responsibility to seek the approval of society for the things they do. And they have a responsibility to do no harm. A classical view is organisations only have a responsibility to be profitable because by doing so they employ people, and then by employing people they give people resources to then make their own judgments about what is right and what is wrong. So you see the two arguments there? Now, if I put forward an argument that was premised on the logic that it's important for an organisation to seek the approval of society, so that to get society to agree with what they're proposing to do, somebody who holds a classical view may not agree with it. True? So somehow I need to engage them in a conversation that enables them to hold an alternative opinion to me. But I've done so. The argument I formed is structured in such a way that they still are willing to actually hear and understand my evidence. To go on that journey with me, to be at least willing to actually, whilst not agree with, to consider an alternative argument. So this, you can see in that case that I might actually have to provide a warrant, or I might have to provide evidence in support of my warrant. So I might sort of say, for example, if my argument or my warrant or my logic behind my argument in this case is that it's important that organisations do what's right, and they seek the permission or the approval of society to act or behave in a certain way, I might actually then have to provide evidence that says, well, if you don't do that, there's an economic a consequence. Your organisation will not perform as well as those who do that. Or I may have to provide another warrant that sort of says that organisations ultimately don't enter into a social contract with society, ultimately end up losing the permission to operate, and they actually often end up not continuing on as an organisational entity. So I guess what I'm saying here is that a warrant in itself is important, but it also has to be acceptable to the people you're making that claim to, the audience you're trying to respond to. So warrants express justifying principles. There are ways of doing this. Whenever X, then Y, let's see ships. I mean, these are examples of warrants. There's a form there. So the form of the logic is that this is related to that. Okay? If this, then that. Now, there are different ways of actually forming, providing that logic, and that's not really the purpose of this presentation today. And the book actually provides a great deal more detail, I guess, and some other examples of how you might actually do this. But my point here today is to actually understand one thing, to take one thing away. And that's that just by simply providing evidence that's linked to some claim that you're trying to make is not sufficient to actually persuade or to seek agreement from the person you're trying to influence. That to actually have that impact, that benefit, you need to actually understand that it's the logic that lies behind that relationship that's important. And we frame that, or we describe that in terms of warrants. Okay, do I have permission to go on? Yeah. So if you do this well, if you acknowledge and respond to alternative viewpoints, if you think about your logic and then think about who may support or disagree with that logic, and then you actually go through a process of actually responding. So you consider that alternative, that objection, and then you go through a process of actually thinking about how you may actually respond to that. So I gave an example there before in terms of the social contract. Then what's going to actually end up happening is you're going to produce trust, and people are going to be more likely to at least give you permission to go forward. Because that's your objective here. When you're making an academic argument, the goal, the objective is that you'll get permission to move forward. Okay? So even if they don't agree with the logic that you provided, they can understand your logic. Your logic is explicit. So it's not kind of left out there for a person to kind of decide upon themselves. It's explicit, and they can decide whether or not they agree with you. But hopefully the process of actually providing that logic, that evidence, and linking the evidence to the claim is done in such a way that, and I've seen this myself when I've been reviewing papers, I may not necessarily agree with the principle of what they're trying to say, but the way they've framed it has been done so effectively they've considered and represented the various viewpoints, opposing viewpoints in such an effective way that I go forward with them on that journey. And then what I'm interested in seeing from that point forward is whether or not their evidence is sufficiently well developed to help me to change my view. And that's kind of our goal as researchers. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a master's student or a doctoral student or an early career researcher or even a mature researcher. Ultimately, this is what we do when we try to publish, when we try to write our research up. This is what we're trying to do. And organisations are interested in actually... sorry, let me step back a bit. Quite often, I hear claims made by my academic colleagues that the credibility of academic research is lacking. That organisations are not using the results of academic research. They're not influencing their thinking and their behaviour in the marketplace. My argument is quite often, as academics, we don't frame our research to influence that group of decision makers. We frame our research to influence the academic decision maker or the academic author who we want to read and cite our work. And one of the arguments here is if we actually want to influence that group, well, we need to frame our arguments differently. We also need to frame our arguments with that audience in mind. So anyway, so the goal here is really to... so an acknowledgement or response is really about sort of saying that there are quite often different views that exist within the marketplace or the academic literature that we actually need to understand and we need to actually incorporate within our own reasoning. Was there a hand? Yeah.
Short question.
Yeah,
Does it mean, well, when we frame our discussion for academics, does it mean that, well, it's less practical, or did we forget about the practicality?
Quite often.
Then maybe it's not useful.
Yeah.
Maybe it shall be useful for business and academics, or it's impossible.
So the question is sometimes do we actually do that? Do we make a connection between the academic research and the practical use effectively? Now, I've got a number of ways of responding to that. I think the first thing is quite often that linkage is actually an afterthought. We do the research. We may have started with a practical problem in mind. But we go through. We then turn that into a research problem. We go through a process. We get to the end. We've got a contribution to theory. We kind of state that because that's our objective as academics or researchers. But then that link back to the actual research problem, that closing of the loop, is an afterthought. It's a secondary interest. It's lesser important. So I think that if we dedicated as much time to the linking the outcomes or the findings of our research to the theory and the sort of the conceptual sort of learnings or the knowledge generated from our research, if we made the same effort to actually link it back to the practical outcomes, well then I think we do a better job. But quite often I think that link is actually quite tenuous. That's the first point I would make. The second point is this, is there is a distinction between basic and applied research. So sometimes, if you work in a laboratory or sciences and you're actually doing theoretical physics, you don't really expect there's a link between the research you do in that laboratory and some practical application. There may be, but your focus is actually not the practical application. Now, in the business, social sciences and business space, that's not the case often. Quite often there is a practical implication of the research we're actually doing. But it requires us at some level to recognise that as a different audience from the academic research that we're actually undertaking. And actually in doing so, thinking about the arguments that are inherent within that audience, the sorts of things that the audience may like to engage with, the conversations they want to have with us, and in some way actually framing our research in a way that actually directly responds to that need. Now that's it's a different audience, and it requires a different framing and a different argument.
Doesn't mean that the theory or science will never, so to say, support or sufficiently support business. Because the audience...
I don't hold that view. Yeah, I understand the point you're actually making, and I think that, so without digressing too much, and I appreciate your point actually, because it is quite a good one, is that quite often there's a view that by doing research there may not be a relationship with the practical problem we're actually trying to respond to. And quite often, industry may actually hold a view about the relevance or the practical benefit of a piece of research based on the merits of the academic the academic process or the things that are actually undertaken from an academic audience perspective. Now, my view is that I think that academics ought to have the capacity to speak to both audiences. I think it's really important in the business area in particular that we have the capacity to talk to industry as well as to academics. Now, I don't hold that, and this is kind of where probably my thinking is coming from, I don't hold the view that academic research is not of benefit or value to industry. My experience has been when I do consulting work, for example, that quite often it's the fact that I can actually put an answer to a problem in a theoretical context, so it provides contextual relevance to that answer, that is actually important. And the industry may actually not even understand that before we start talking. So they may have alternative ways of getting information to help them resolve a practical problem. They can go to a consultant. The consultant can give them an answer, but very rarely will a consultant put that answer in the context that an academic will. So we think about a problem in terms of the broader theoretical implications. We think about the types of issues that limit the boundaries of the problem we're trying to address, and we're actually able to have that conversation in a way that helps them to actually understand where their answer fits in a broader scheme of things. So I guess in response to your question, I think that there's an art to doing that well. I don't think academics necessarily do it well. If we did, I go back to the 1950s, Theodore Levitt was consulted by heads of states. Academics were thought leaders. Regrettably now, I think quite a lot of academics are much more interested in communicating to their peers, to the academic audience, than they are to communicating to industry. And the consequence has been that we don't drive thought. We just comment on what industry is doing. That's a whole other conversation for another day, but it does come down to the effectiveness of our argument development for that specific audience. Okay, so concessions to the centre. So we acknowledge that there is opposition to our argument, okay? We actually then need to actually incorporate that opposition into our argument development. We need to acknowledge that there's a disagreement. And if we do that well, and this comes back to some of the phraseology that Alison alluded to. So if you do that well, so the however, or the therefore, if you do that well, people will they'll be willing to at least go with you on that journey. They'll give you permission to go forward, because you've acknowledged that your opinion is maybe sometimes different to theirs. And it's really often the acknowledgement which is needed. There's really, often I'll read a paper, and one of the things I get frustrated by is when I see a case put forward that seems to ignore a really significant body of literature. And it's a pitfall. It's a pitfall for early career researchers in particular. Maybe it's because they actually don't know that literature exists. Maybe because that literature is not consistent with what they're trying to say, and they feel if they put it forward that their argument will be somehow diminished. But nevertheless, they ignore it, and the end result is they get rejected. That's usually what happens. So coming to terms with and conceding to dissenters is an important aspect of argument development. So it says here on 48%, keep in mind that the final bit, 25%, I've lobbed off. So, we're almost 3/4 or 2/3 of the way through, is a better way of expressing it. And, according to my time, I've still got 24 minutes to go. I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so using the parts of an argument. So a little bit more about claims. So make sure your readers can recognise what your claim is and actually recognise its significance. I'm actually a real supporter of this idea of actually making a very explicit short statement and then building on to, then drawing the literature and actually trying to attach that evidence to the reason to that claim and then consequently providing the warrant. I'm actually really a supporter of actually very explicit statements so that people can't be confused as to what you're trying to say. Sometimes a strategy that other researchers will use is they present the evidence and the linkage between they present the evidence first, and then remember that reason comes before claim, or claim supported by reasons, and they get to the end and they present the claim. And I personally find that sometimes a little bit hard to follow, because I'm reading their reasons and I'm forming my own claims. And then when I get to their claim, I'm thinking, that's not consistent with the claim I thought you were going to make. So for me, I find it much more, and it's just my personal preference, okay? I find it much more intuitive to provide the claim and then provide the reasons. Although different methodologies apply different approaches. So if you're doing an inductive piece of qualitative research, you're kind of trying to build, if you like, you're trying to build a critical mass of evidence that draws you along the path to a claim. So there are methodological differences here. But for me, I've always found the logic of a claim first, supported by good evidence and reasons, is much more persuasive. So how would you go about evaluating a good claim? Well, the solution is possible. That may sound simple, And actually, it's quite often overlooked. I mean, but nevertheless, it needs to be plausible. So we would talk about face validity, wouldn't we, in a research sense? We'd say the claim has initial face validity. Intuitively, it makes some sense. It's at least plausible. Your solution is ethical. Now, I touched on one of these sort of ethical dilemmas previously, didn't I? So sometimes there are moral compasses that kind of conflict with one another, and you need to recognise if one of the claims that you're making is going to appeal to some set of logic which may be diametrically opposed by an alternative view. And if that's the case, you've got to confront it, you've got to acknowledge it, you've got to frame your logic, frame your argument in such a way to seek permission of that audience to move forward. Now, but these are often the hardest things to actually do. Okay? So these are often the hardest claims to make, is where you're actually taking some moral view. You're taking a stand on some point. And that's probably why I'm not a philosopher. I'm an academic researcher in the business area. Because these are really tough questions or tough solutions to frame. Your solution is prudent, so it takes into consideration both the problem you seek to resolve and the possible ramifications of your proposal. So a claim needs to be contextual, it needs to be relevant, and prudence in this case just simply means that you consider the broader subset of conclusions that can be made about the claim you're making. So stating your reason, so you've made your claim, it's a plausible solution, you've avoided those ethical dilemmas or moral questions that kind of tend to pose and represent a threat to the claim you're trying to make. You then need to go and state your reasons in a way that's going to engage people and form a linkage between the evidence and the claim you're trying to support. So in choosing what reasons to include, you need to be aware of your audience. So you need to use, I'm actually a service science researcher, so I'm just looking, and Ben's in a similar boat to me. I mean, we kind of cut across different disciplinary boundaries. So I cut across the information systems, operations, research, and the marketing space. Now, by doing that, I often have to be really careful to frame the logic of my claims and the reason and evidence I'm providing support of those claims using the language which is acceptable to that community I'm trying to communicate to. So, for example, if I'm trying to provide evidence in support of a marketing proposition, well, I need to make sure that I'm actually using the terminology which is contemporary within that debate in the marketing community. There's no point drawing upon. So, Alison talked about an example of technology adoption and acceptance, which is a really famous, well-established construct or concept within the information systems area. To use the terminology or logic which is inherent within information systems and then import it into the marketing or management space, you're going to find problems. You either need to define those constructs or concepts well, so you need to define them in a way that's acceptable to that community, or you need to recognise that you need to actually frame that information that comes from another community using the terminology, the lingua franca, the language, which is acceptable to the community you're trying to persuade. And quite often that's not an easy thing to do. And that's one of the reasons why multidisciplinary research is not actually done effectively. Because it's really hard to find that agreement about language we actually use to talk across communities. And this is why, once again, the importance of audience is foremost in this sort of argument development. So you need to know the general gaze and priorities of your readers, what they will count as good reasons, and equally what they will count as good warrants in support of those reasons. Evaluate the evidence. So how would we go about evaluating? Well, the evidence needs to be what? Reliable. So, I mean, a really good example of this, and I think one of the questions, I'm trying to see who actually asked the question about the gap model. Was that, no? Who asked the question about the gap model earlier? There we go, thank you, sorry, I'm attributing it to somebody else. So, I mean, the gap models are actually, it's really interesting because it's become a framework for understanding service quality. But the reality was, it was a framework for actually translating academic insight into practical benefits. So if you look at the gap model, it actually really talks to the types of interventions an organisation may make. So if there's a gap in terms of our understanding about a need of a customer, well, we actually need to do a marketing intervention to actually understand that customer need more effectively. If the gap is in terms of executing on the delivery of a service, so we have a service delivery problem, we know what we want to deliver, but then we failed in terms of delivery, well, there may be a training intervention that's required there between the two. So why do I raise that here? Because in the context of that body of research, there's been questions regarding the reliability of the findings. So over time, what we've actually got is we've actually generated what I would refer to as a relatively weak mid-range theory. So a theory that kind of, we've taken it up so far that in order to be generalisable, we bring it down now to a context, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense sometimes. And the results are inconsistent across contexts. So why is this important in terms of argument development? Because if you're actually drawing upon evidence in support of a claim, it has to be reliable. So you can't have somebody thinking in the back of their mind, well, hang on a second, I've done this study using the same construct in a similar context and got a completely different set of results. So if that were the case, we'd have to acknowledge the variability in the application of that evidence. And if we don't, we're going to open up a challenge that we may not be able to overcome. So appropriate citation, so obviously evidence, and this comes back to that point actually. And I wasn't intending to make this point earlier when I asked the question about secondary referencing, but about the importance of going back to the primary source. I've published some really successful people in the management space, and I've really been enthused, and I've learned a lot about the way they go back and evaluate evidence, and it's helped me actually in the way I approach the use of evidence in my own research. So these are designed to appeal to the values and the priorities of your target audience. So often we'll have a plethora of evidence that's available, but how do we choose the right evidence? Sometimes we need to, say for example, you're trying to publish a piece of research in a specific contextual outlet. So you're a service researcher, but you want to publish something in the tourism space. Now there's a body of service quality literature that exists in the service context, but you may want to actually go and then tap that body of literature which is relevant to services or hospitality specifically, that's published in their journals. So, by doing that, you may appeal to the values and priorities of your audience. You may sort of help them to understand how their findings may be relevant outside of their particular context. So there are things we can actually do to ensure that when we evaluate the evidence we're using, that we can actually make some evaluation as to its appropriateness. And this last point's important as well, ample enough to convince. So I tend to agree, I find it's really disconcerting when I'm actually reading an article and I'm thinking, gee, I can't pull out what this article is trying to say because every sentence is supported by 20 articles, printing references. And I'm thinking, well, you haven't persuaded us. You've lost me somehow. So ample enough to convince, that's usually determined by the conventions of the discipline. So 2 or 3 good references are preferable over 10 or 20 sort of average references. But, and also too, the way you reference within a thesis is different than the way you reference within an article. So with an article, you're looking for 2 things. You're looking for seminal, and you're looking for currency. So if you're going to make a choice about which references to cite, you want to make sure they're the most important ones. You want to make sure they're current, so that the issues and debates that you're trying to address in your research are still relevant to the debate now, today. 2 bits of advice there in terms of evaluating your evidence. So arguing through evidence. So you need to move from the general to the specific. You build on what readers know. You don't rehearse your own work process, instead support your conclusions. So don't support your own work process or rehearse your own work process is really to deal with this issue of just presenting the evidence in a way that is sequentially aligned with the argument you're trying to make without synthesising in a way that provides a claim, provides evidence supporting your claim. So I need to say that again. So you need to understand that just presenting evidence in a sequence as your argument develops is not quite the same as synthesising evidence and bringing the right evidence together and aligning it potentially at the right time to support the claim in the best possible way. Now that's a pretty subtle comment that I've just made, and it's really actually it's not an easy thing to do, I acknowledge that. But it's about kind of getting the right evidence, putting it together the right way, and focusing on the conclusion you can draw by synthesising effectively. So sometimes it's easier when you've got really complex evidence you're trying to synthesise to use things like tables and figures and the like, but maybe to actually draw together those that evidence in a way that actually helps people to understand it more easily. And keep the support appropriate and as simple as you possibly can. And then authority of an expert, that's really about sort of saying that, okay, I've made a point about evidence being seminal and being current. There are good sources and there are better sources. So for me, I tend to focus with my students are writing their first papers. I tend to focus on actually helping them to understand where the key journals are in that discipline space, and making sure that their article is actually supported by the base within those key outlets. Now that's not to say that something that's written in a journal which is not as well established, it's a newer journal, so it's maybe its impact factor is not as high, or it's published in an area that's not as well read, is necessarily a bad output. You can actually have good outputs that appear in modest journals. But if you're trying to persuade somebody, it's sometimes easier to draw upon an expert witness. And an expert witness in a in an argument development, academic argument development sense, is drawn from a good reputable journal. It's got a better peer review process. The chances of actually having an extraneous finding is fewer than, for example, that you may find. So the variability in lesser ranked, more modest journals tends to be more variable. So anyway, so my argument here is really about sort of drawing upon an authoritative or an expert opinion. In this case, the evidence is drawn from a good journal. And helping your audience know what's important. So sometimes you actually need to say, I've used this outlet or this source because this source is better, it's more cited, it's more established, it's more relevant to this particular context. And sometimes you just can't hope that those references are going to be sort of understood implicitly. You may have to explicitly sort of mention it. You may need to tell them what you've done, So more unclear warrants, and now I'm going to have that example that Jay's been prompting me for. So warrants, as I said before, they link your reasons to your claims, and they do so in a logical way. They state the logic that underpins that link between, or the relationship between your reason, your evidence, and your claim. Now, whether your warrants are either assumed or implied, so assumed warrants don't actually often need to be expressed. It's still crucial that your audience is able to recognise the warrant. So it's either a commonly held belief within a community you're trying to communicate with, or they're able to determine that they agree or accept your warrant. So, and sometimes, like I said, it's appropriate to create tension. So actually take the person on a journey where the starting point for that journey may be disagreement. So determining good warrant. So do your readers know the warrant already? So is it acceptable? Is it pervasive? Will the readers think it is true? Are they likely to accept it? If they're not likely to accept it, what's the alternative warrant you could actually use? Will they see its connection to the circumstance or situation? Sometimes you can have a really well-held, understood belief, but when you actually really breaks down, the evidence you're presenting is actually not really an example of that logic. But, so you may need to go away and find more different evidence, better evidence which is more supportive of the logic you're trying to display. And the validity and appropriateness of the warrant is also a consideration here. So, in this example, so consider a case where an audience might not accept your argument unless it accepts your warrant. So you actually make an argument, so a child goes to a mother, I need new shoes, the mum says, but why? What are your reasons? Because the other kids have them, a fashion statement, or because red is in this season, my shoes are blue. So the little cross there sort of indicates that the child's putting forward the warrant in support of their claim. So the evidence here is really about sort of saying that the shoes that they got are inadequate. The logic that links the inadequacy of their shoes to the claim that they need new shoes is really to do with some sort of fashion sort of objective. Now, it's likely in that situation the mother is probably going to say no. Or I guess my wife would say no if my child put up that argument. So I'm assuming that other mothers or children of mothers in the audience may have actually had sort of experienced something similar in their lifetime. So a productive argument will require that they find some common ground. So the warrant they're putting up in defence of my shoes are inadequate and I need new shoes needs to be acceptable to both the audience and the person who's making that argument. Make sense? So what's the common ground? Well, I need new shoes because these ones have holes in them and it's raining outside. It's a rainy season. So the mother might be more likely to accept that argument because they share the warrant. They recognise that holding shoes in wet weather is actually not a good thing. So keeping a child safe and free from a cold or some sort of negative consequence of having holes in their shoes in wet weather is a desirable thing. Now, it's a simplistic example. It's probably, doesn't relate to anybody's research here. I don't think anybody's researching shoes and fashion acceptance and adoption. So, but nevertheless, you can see here the principle that I'm actually trying to advocate for is that the warrant needs to be relevant to both the audience, there has to be some common ground, and the person who's making that claim. Now, in this case, the child probably doesn't have capacity to actually question the quality of their warrant. Sometimes, I know with my own children, they tend to be motivated by the moment. And their logic, they may think, is terribly insightful in their own mind, but as a parent, you're kind of not really accepting of that logic. So I guess that as academic researchers, we should be detached to some extent from the evidence we're providing and the claim we're actually trying to make, and detached in such a way that we can actually honestly and appropriately evaluate the quality of the warrants we're putting forward. We need to be somewhat detached from our research to enable us to do that. Often people who actually aren't able to do that, are not able to have that detachment, are those people who kind of, they get the review back from their paper, and they just don't know what happened. I don't kind of get it, you know. I wrote a paper last month and it was accepted, you know, with minor revision. And now I've written this other paper and it's rejected, and I just don't get it. I don't get why. Quite often, they were just lucky. Because the warrants they put forward in the first paper were acceptable, but they didn't actually understand that the logic of the second paper was not supported by the audience they're trying to appeal to. So I think, for me, I try to encourage my students to be passionate about their research, but detached from the arguments they're making, so they can critically appraise, evaluate those arguments. Not so easy. Not so easy to do, because often the two things are not distinguishable. So another way to look at warrants, if you believe the general principle stated about the general circumstances by a warrant, so people who fall asleep at work probably aren't getting enough sleep at home, you're likely to connect the specific case of tiredness, so in this case, falling asleep at your computer, with the specific conclusion that you haven't got enough adequate rest. And there are a lot of other reasons why a person would fall asleep at a computer. A person could be ill. They could have some virus that's affecting their capacity to concentrate, is actually making them drowsy. Maybe they're taking some medication for that illness. There's a lot of reasons, I guess, is what I'm saying, is why a person may fall asleep at a computer. But if we've got a strong commitment to a particular warrant, in the general sense, then we may be unlikely or unable to see alternatives. Once again, this is why distance is important. So, putting it all together. Can everyone see this? So we've got a claim because of a reason, or reasons that drive claims. You kind of, that's interchangeable, but I kind of like this order. So a claim because of a reason, and which is based on some evidence. So evidence of reason in this case is kind of, can be very close, or can be quite distant, depending on the nature or the maturity of a research problem. We acknowledge responses, alternatives to the claim that we're actually trying to make, and the support that's available, and the warrant that we're drawing upon. And a warrant connects this with this in such a way that enables us to get permission to present our evidence. Now, if we don't do this well, we don't do that. Okay? It doesn't really matter how good that evidence is. We're going to have fantastic data, really well analysed, quite sophisticated statistical techniques, but we never get a chance to actually introduce it. Why? It's like, it's like a policeman that collects evidence in the wrong way and can't present it at court. Okay? So in this case, we want to get to a point where our evidence is being considered. To do that, we've got to actually have a reasonable connection between these two things, and that sometimes ends up being supported by an explicit statement of a warrant. The bottom loop is really just about kind of improving the quality of your argument. Quite often, you can do all of this, and if you do it effectively, it really doesn't matter what this is. But I would argue that's really that's your safety net. Okay. So if you do that after you've done that well, then that's going to enhance your chances of success. If you do this and that's not been done well, it doesn't really matter. That's not going to be enough to get you across the line. Does that make sense? Yeah? You can see people are a bit tired. We want to show you. We're almost done, guys. How many more minutes do I have? I haven't had one of those little reminders about how I've got 72%. I told you I've got rid of the last 25%, so I've actually only got 3% to go. Does it make you feel better now? Do you feel better now? Only 3%? I saw somebody at the back just open their eyes and say, yeah. So anyway, so assessing and revising your argument, I'm not going to cover that today, but I will in conclusion say more on the method. So the craft of research is just one way of doing this, okay? I mean, there's whole disciplines of philosophy that are dedicated to the understanding and the presentation of logic. I mean, I'm not a philosopher. What I'm presenting here is I'm presenting the application of philosophy to the development of academic argument, a very specific case of philosophy. Now, if you want to sort of look outside that, I mean, I would encourage you to have a look at craft of research and then actually go back and actually think about, and look at some of the citations they actually refer to within their book. That is really about that logic and the argument of logic. But it does, I believe, present a model, a framework for how we may go about considering the elements of an academic argument, about understanding. So we come back, herald back once more to Alison's presentation this morning. So we know that we need to position. So we have a problem statement. That problem statement's got to be supported by a positioning of our research. And that positioning is often what we do in the introductory sections of our paper, our theses, even our presentation proposals. Those elements that Alison talked about, those 4 elements of a good introduction, are in themselves many arguments that have to flow to one another, but then collectively make sense. They have to hang together in a way which makes sense collectively. This framework gives us some strategies and tools for how we actually may frame those mini arguments. Okay? May help us to understand why sometimes we have success, whereas other times we don't. Now let me just, as a sidebar, make this point. If you've not yet done your defence, so your confirmation seminar, we call them in Australia, well, this is my institution anyway. If you've not actually done that yet, the process of defending your proposal is about making a series of arguments and then making sure that the people that are in your audience, and in particular those people that are assessing your performance, are persuaded. They're persuaded to go with you on the journey, to allow you to go to the next step of gathering your evidence. Okay. Argument structures and comprehension. By giving readers a framework, even if they don't agree with your framework, even if they don't agree with your argument, it makes it easier for them to tell you where they don't agree. Now this is relevant in the context of publishing in academic journals, because I've got to tell you, there's nothing more meaningless. Oh, it's almost over. So there's nothing more meaningless than getting feedback that's irrelevant to the thing you're trying to achieve, or it's not helpful. So sometimes when you provide this framework, what you also do is you enable your assessor, your reviewer, to actually provide their feedback in a way that actually helps you to understand what elements of your argument are weak. So you provide a framework not just for presenting your argument, but for them responding to your argument. Now that connection is actually really quite powerful, and it's probably quite implicit, and the people that are reviewing your article don't actually really know that's what they're doing. But because you've framed your argument in such a way, they'll actually be able to say which bit of it they didn't like, and that'll help you in terms of reframing your argument later, either for publication in that journal or for response to reviewer comments. So the last point here is that once you've done all of this, so once you've presented, you've framed your arguments, once you've presented your paper, you've not finished. So that section that I've skipped over today, which you'll go back, it's homework and do in your own time, I'm sure, has the final stage, the simplification. So the principle of parsimony applies here, okay? So you need to provide just enough or adequate evidence in support of your argument. You also need to go through and then revise your argument and ensure that while it may be tempting to provide every possible alternative viewpoint to yours, so every opposition, every dissension to your viewpoint, it may not be appropriate to do so. Because it may take your paper from being 5,000 words to being 15,000 words, and that may not be acceptable to the journal. So you may need to then go through, and your final step is really about understanding whether or not you provided too much argument and how you may simplify that process. So what do you want to say? Should your readers care? And why should your readers agree? So you have to go about answering those questions. Hone your introduction and thesis statements, make costs and benefits explicit, and connect reasons with evidence and warrants. So that final stage is your final kind of, I've just written my thesis, I feel like I'm dead, I've just arisen from that coma after 2 weeks of sort of not wanting to ever look at it again. And now I need to clean it up. I need to go through and just kind of tidy those arguments up and just make sure it all hangs together appropriately. That's your final stage. So there's some references. These slides will be available, as I said. And if you want to connect with me, if you have any questions about what I presented today, then you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I find that's the easiest thing because, to be honest, cards don't really work for me. My wife actually organised my cards about a week, probably about a month ago now, and I had a plastic, those plastic bags you see at the airport where you put your liquids in. I had 2 or 3 of those, chock-a-block of cards that I'm never likely ever to open and read again. So the reality for me is if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you want to talk to me, send me a message and do so that way. And it's much more likely that you'll get a good view of what I'm up to and what the things I'm doing at the moment are, my latest research and the like. So there we go. And then, oh, look at that. See another, we'll keep going. No. So that's the last section that I said that I've glossed over that you may want to look at in your own time. Are there any questions? Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
Could you go back to the figure?
My figure? Wait. Sorry. This one.
Yeah, so I remember when we write paper, we would mention limitations. So do limitations have a position in the argumentation?
That's a really good question. So do limitations have a position in the argumentation? To some extent, acknowledging alternative viewpoints is a way of actually acknowledging up front what the limitations may be. So it's about sort of saying that I'm putting a ring fence, I'm constraining what I'm actually trying to achieve here in such a way that I'm responding to those alternatives, but I'm not actually dealing with them. That's somebody else's job in another piece of research. In an academic paper, once again, kind of almost like that conversation I had before about sort of practical implications of research coming as an afterthought, limitations often come as an afterthought. Now there's 2 reasons, 2 arguments as to why that's the case. The first one is that every research has limitations, and as academic researchers, we actually know that. And really what we're actually after is we're just interested in expressing that we know there are limitations to this research, but it's the best I could do under the constraints that I have, and we present that as a case without ever really defending whether it's sufficient. Now the only time that doesn't hold true is when the limitations are actually material limitations. So there's a fatal flaw in the way we've collected our data. There's a significant omission in our theoretical or conceptual framework. In those cases, you can't get to the other end and disclaim that away with a limitation statement. It's too late. I would actually argue that sometimes I submit, like when I was early on in my academic career, I would submit papers and I actually wouldn't really know what the limitations were. I thought I did, but then somebody would come back and sort of say, you haven't done that. And they would reject the paper, and 2 or 3 weeks later, after kind of crying, I'd kind of pick up the paper again and have a read. And I'd say, yeah, they're right. And if I was really lucky, I actually had the evidence of response that I could actually bring and put that into a paper and send it off to somewhere else. And so I guess limitations do have a role in the argument, but there's always a balancing act, isn't there, between an acknowledgement that every research has some implicit weakness and that what you've actually done is sufficient given constraints of a research project. But it's a really good question, thank you. Any other questions? So somebody up the back just yawned. Is that? Poor gentleman thought I was pointing at him. I was glossing it, so it didn't actually look like I was pointing at the person. But in the end, I ended up pointing at you. You shouldn't yawn. That's really good. So, are there any other questions? People have any questions? Does anybody? Okay, let me ask you a question then. So, as a concept, academic argument development, does it make sense in the context of the research you're doing at the moment? Can you see maybe where your research could be improved? We've got some nods. Okay, let me frame that differently. Because we have some master's students, we have some doctoral students, we have early career researchers. So of your master's students, of the master's students in the audience, it's not uncommon for students at that level to be focused just on the research process. So collecting your data, analysing your data, presenting your findings. So the idea of stepping back from that process and then thinking about the quality of the argument is sort of, it's almost a separate process entirely. So I guess that my comment to people in that group is that is that if this does nothing else, it should help you to frame the way you present your findings to an audience at some point in the future. And it should help you if you want to then go from collecting that data to publishing that data in a peer-reviewed journal. It'll actually help you to actually understand what, from that quite sizable thesis or dissertation you'll create, what needs to go into that paper and what doesn't. So that's maybe a point of reference for the future. For those that are doctoral students with aspirations of an academic career, so maybe I know there are some of you here that are doing a doctorate at the same time teaching. My, I guess, takeaway for you guys is that if you want a promising career in academia, you need to come to terms with this sort of logic. Because it's the kind of the hidden reason for why people succeed and people don't. And it's really that fundamental. You don't come to terms with formation of these arguments, you don't come to terms with how to present all this great stuff that you're doing, then you'll enjoy limited success in academia. Because we live in a system with perverse incentives. Doesn't matter how great a teacher you are, doesn't matter how engaged with industry you are, at the end of the day, if you're not publishing your papers, you're researching good journals, then you'll have limited opportunities for advancement and progression. So it's a perverse incentive. Once upon a time we researched because we wanted to be better teachers. Now we're actually saying that research in itself is an end. But anyway, so if you want an academic career, it's really important you engage with this. If you're an ECR, so you've done your PhD, you've got, once again, this thesis, dissertation, you want to know how to extract papers out of that. These are some tools to help you to do that. Maybe if you're a little bit more advanced, you're thinking, well, how do I get tenure? These sort of this argument development process is not just beneficial in terms of presenting academic papers, it also helps you to actually put together your portfolio or your application for promotion or a grant application for funding from an external body. The same principles apply. So for you guys, I think it's really actually about, because there's a step you go through once you actually, because you do your data collection or you do your thesis as a doctoral student, and you've got all this data, and you can spend the next 10 years publishing it as long as it's not dated. But then once you move beyond that, you need a way of actually then thinking about what next. So how do I actually build upon the arguments I've made in that earlier work? How do I extrapolate and exploit those? How do I then move to the next project? How do I get funding for the data collection? These are all challenges. If we go back to that original evolution of an academic, that's what happens in the middle. And in that case, this provides a basis for actually to respond to some of those challenges. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you very much. I think we have lunch.